I usually give. But I want just to share with you, to start with, two experiences that I had very recently that I think are a good place to start. Just last week, in fact just under a week ago, a friend of ours died. I knew nothing about it until Wednesday when a phone call came and was told of it. And I thought I should go and see the person, the man who remained. And I don't actually have so much experience of talking to people after their husbands and or wives have died. And I really had no idea what to say, but I just felt I should go. And I walked into this fellow, and he was obviously somewhat broken up by the experience, and he did the whole talking. I just sat there and every so often nodded and said yes and various other things, and he just told me how his wife had passed through the last few weeks before her death. And then he came out with a sentence that left me totally, shattered is perhaps too strong, but questioning. And he said, I guess, looking back, I listened more to my wife than I did to the Lord. That was all he said. And how do you follow a comment like that? So we just sat in silence for a few minutes. I guess I listened more to my wife than I did to the Lord. I think if there is a number one weakness in Christian marriage, that is where it is. The tremendous danger of treating wives as more important than God. It is actually very easy to do. You are so much more tangible. It is much easier to know your wills than it is the will of God sometimes. That was the first thing. And I think it's important to understand that, because as I go through, wives could very easily begin to feel that I'm just putting a whole load more pressures on them. And I certainly don't want you to feel that. The other thing is a little less serious. I was reading a survey which was actually put out by a butcher's organisation. Not quite sure the significance of that. But the butchers had gathered together and had asked various married couples who had been married somewhere in the order of 6 years, if you had your time over again, would you marry the same partner? Very interesting question. But 50% of the women said no. 50%. Over half the women thought, well, if this is what marriage is all about, I'd rather try somebody else. That didn't mean they were leaving their husbands necessarily. But interestingly, 80% of the men said they would. So it seems like the women have got a much better idea of what men want than the other way around. Which means, in a way, that Tosa's got a much harder job tomorrow than I've got today. But I found that a fascinating piece of information. But when I was thinking through, I asked myself, what is it that I need? And there came up this sort of immediate training that I've had. Whenever anybody throws a word at you, you immediately ask them, what does it mean? And it's important, as we go through, to distinguish between a need and a want. There are many things that I think I need. And I will communicate to my wife a need. Sometimes very, very clearly. And actually it won't be a need at all. It will be another four-letter word, a want. I want. I want. And if any of you have got kids, you know that how that word can just about drive you to distraction when you're desperately trying to get into your children the importance of saying please and of requesting properly, and you get this, I want, I want, I want. And some of us in our marriages, that is what we're communicating. And it's got nothing at all to do with needs. And I'm not sure, as I go through these things that I have written here today, that I've made a very needing cars, needing experiences, and many times it's not a need at all. Vitally important to try and understand the distinction, and sometimes very hard to actually put your finger on, because sometimes a want is expressing a need. They're not always the same thing. A wife may want a bunch of flowers because it expresses, if she gets that, she realizes there's a communication there that the man has recognized her need of something beautiful around her, some indication that he cares for her. A lot of difference between those two things. A very simple illustration, and yet difficult sometimes to pin. With those preliminaries, let's sort of head into the sort of material. And the first thing it struck me, as I began thinking about marriage, I won't tell you how long ago that was, one thing I wanted very much indeed was someone of whom I could be proud. Somebody who, when people looked at, they would say, oh, she's all right. And I'm not just talking about somebody who's the right shape. Because it's unfortunately true that women tend not to stay the shape that you first see them as. Some get thinner and some don't. But I wanted somebody who I felt, others would say, yes, she's good for you, she matches you. And I can remember the first time my wife came to our home, and so can she. And it was Christmas, all our family together, and most of my family talk at least as fast as I do, and are at least as impatient as I am. Some are more so. And there was a repartee going across the table all the time, and just every so often Anna-Marie would just drop a word in that left my mother totally flabbergasted. How could a foreigner keep pace with this? I'm convinced that there was some prejudice against foreigners initially, but I tell you, they disappeared around that table very quickly. And everybody we met, before we got married, we would ask the question, and they would say, yes, you just can't believe it, that somebody who can match you in this area. And I felt proud. I sometimes think I've taught her too well now. She beats me more often than I like to admit. But somebody to be proud of. Somebody we can show to our friends. And if you feel embarrassed with your partner before you're married, watch out. That is going to be a major area of danger later on. The story of Esther is very significant. A man wanted to show off his wife to his friends. And the reaction of the man when the woman put him down. Now that was after marriage. But it betrays a desire, I think, that most men have of wanting to feel confident when they present their wife that she will respond. That when he says, look, we're going out together, that she won't turn up in an old pair of jeans that sort of look like they've been through the washing machine 1,000 times and came out of Charlie originally anyway, or wherever. When he says, look, we are going somewhere, that she will treat that maybe even more important than he does. Sometimes that is a very rare event. But if she lets him down then, it's like a quick knife between the ribs, and he won't do it again. Somebody he can be proud of. In her appearance. It is very easy, especially after a while in marriage, to be very careless in appearance. Very easy, especially on a limited budget. Great temptation for many of us. Men probably are a lot worse in this than women, but you do see wives, they get tired, they get discouraged, the kids just about pour something down the skirt every time they put a clean one on, and they begin to say, what is the use? It's a temptation. But men do notice appearance, more usually than they admit. And I think the appearance of the inner attitude, a sort of modesty and a holiness about a woman, is something that is hard to define, but most Christian men desperately want. A woman who doesn't threaten with her spirituality. You know, there are women who every time you talk to them they say, well, let's pray together, and the poor man, he wants to be the one who initiates, let's pray together. She may have somehow to encourage him to come round to that position. That's something women have to learn. But somehow that being proud of her in the spiritual sense of the word, I know I've got a woman of God. And when you have a wife and you're confident that her trust is in the Lord, that is worth an incredible amount. Very hard, again, to pin exactly what it is, but a few ideas are dropped by Paul in the 2nd chapter of 1 Timothy in this area. But he's not just interested in appearance, not just interested in pride. It means a lot more. It means somebody who you can completely rely on in public. You know, there are some homes we love to go into, and there's some that we absolutely loathe going into, aren't there? I can remember walking into homes, even before I was married, and you got the opinion, the moment you walked in, you were being called to sign an alliance. And the man would maybe sit in the corner and not say too much. He was watching the television anyway, but the woman would give you a great long list of things, you know. And she wasn't ever saying that he is impossible and I really can't live with him, and you agree, don't you? But that was the whole idea coming over. And then the woman would go out and get the tea, and the man would say, well, you know, of course there's another way of looking at it. And you felt just being pulled apart like that. And some women are very, very good at that, especially when they're mothers. There is a massive danger of using your children as an ally against the other partner. And if you don't believe what that can do to a man, look and see what Rebekah and Jacob did together. Agreeing together to deceive the blind old twit who doesn't really know what real food is anyway. And Jacob, of course, marriage was far from ideal, and he himself later on got deceived by a goat when his own sons went out and slaughtered a goat and brought it back and said, well, your oldest son is dead. Interesting reaping there going on. A few goats in the story of Genesis made fools of more than one person. But the idea of a man having to fight his wife and his children is something we need to be desperately, desperately careful of. And we need to be careful that even before we have children, we're not moving into that. There are times when men are totally and utterly impossible. And most wives could give you a great long list if they wanted to. And most men know it. And it doesn't help when you know you're in the wrong to find you've been confronted by an alliance that is massive. It doesn't help. It never changes behavior to find an alliance against you. It only reinforces the negative. And there is a need in a man to feel that when he is impossible, the wife will stand by him. That is, after all, what she promises when she gets married. For better or for worse. Because most people don't believe ever such a time is going to come when they make the marriage promises. Actually, when we got married, the guy who was translating the vows got him so confused, I don't even know what I promised anymore. That was a very... neither of us know what we promised now, so we're both of us sort of on an interesting situation. But somebody who will support you in public. I like the image of some of you may be old enough to remember the film High Noon, or at least some equally bad Western, where at some point, you know, the sheriff gets out and he knows he's got to shoot it out with the baddie. And the street's clear, and you know the situation. You've probably seen it in 1,000 films. If not, ask George. He's probably got a film hidden away somewhere with such a thing. And they begin walking up the street, and at some point, you know, they're both going to go for their gun. Well, in the film of High Noon, things weren't quite as moral as that. There were a few rotten toads who were ready to shoot the sheriff in the back. And there was an old guy, I forget now who the actor was, but it doesn't matter, who limped and looked horrible. Everything about him was made you go, ugh, you know. But he was a hero because just as some rotter was going to shoot the sheriff in the back, he got him first. He protected the back of the sheriff facing the enemy. And every husband needs that situation. When he's getting into a situation that maybe he's bitten off more than he can chew, maybe he's done something really stupid, but the wife will protect his back. And some wives, you get the feeling the moment he's walking up that high street ready to shoot the enemy, she's getting her knife out. Oh, now I'll get him. There is that temptation, isn't there, in all of us, if we want to score points, and we do with the people we love most, to wait until he's under pressure from somewhere else and then... And if you want to be a wife who your husband will love, protect him when his back is exposed. And it's not an easy thing to do. Agree together that where the two of you are in a situation, it's you and he, if necessary, against the whole of the rest of the world. You can maybe talk about him about the things afterwards. But in the situation, you must stand with him. He'll expect your support. And if you join against him with the enemy, don't be surprised if he utterly savages you. A man who's cornered by a wife plus allies will not fight clean. Certainly if I'm the man, I can tell you. I don't even fight clean when my wife's on my side. But you'll find it'll happen, and you see some very odd things happening. The man will just turn on her, and the woman will say, I don't understand why he reacted so strongly. Well, the answer is she left him in the lurch. And he's defending irrationally. So support and support again in public. But the curious is a curious irony. He will desperately want your support. He will desperately want to feel that you and he are standing together, and one of the things that will probably attract him to you will be your self-sufficiency. There is a curious thing. A man will be drawn to a woman who gives the impression she can cope before marriage. The women who don't get married, and this is not an exclusive, absolute rule, because there are obviously a lot more factors, but somebody who desperately wants at any price to be married probably will stay single. And the woman who gives the impression of not really caring probably will. It's rather like going into a Turkish bazaar. And the goods you really want are the one you walk away from. You say, I'm not interested in paying that price. And you walk away from it. And the guy comes running after you and says, well, I'll let you have it for so much. And so you start bargaining again. And a self-sufficiency in a woman is something a man will place a high value on, especially if he is already in a Christian ministry. A man who already has a ministry of having to give out, traveling all over the world, and many of us in OM are in that kind of situation. The guy's going all over the planet and the poor woman has got to stay somewhere. He doesn't want somebody who's going to say, oh, you're not going to the airport again, dear. As if he liked going to airports. Usually that's not something. The last thing he wants when he's preparing for a trip is somebody to remind him that he actually was only away 2 weeks ago and that he's planning to go away next weekend. What he needs then is somebody who says, well, I'd rather if you were here, but of course I see the need and I'm standing with you. The impression of a real self-sufficiency and one who herself is able to give out to others makes a powerful impact upon a man. I find it's interesting how Paul talks about older women having a definite obligation to teach and encourage and train others. And many of us are moving into the age range where we should be able to think in those terms rather than thinking of taking from the older women. Some of us are already in the older age bracket of OM. Are we able to teach younger women how to love their husbands? To be able to give out. And if a husband can see a wife who can cope when he's gone, a wife who is able to give out to others and has a developing ministry on her own, it will give him a lot more freedom to develop his ministry rather than have to apologize all the time for it. And there's nothing really so devaluing as a man having to apologize to his wife about the work God has given him to do. Effectively, you're calling into question God and you're calling into question your man if that situation develops. And it can happen very quickly. Obviously, we don't want you to be so self-sufficient that when the guy arrives back at the airport, you say, oh, you're here already, I was all ready for another week and I've got this and this and this lined up, you can go away again. That is the tension. It's one of the problems when you begin to talk about marriage. We can see things that are needed and things we want, and yet trying to get the balance and get a real sort of humanity in there is not so easy. But to balance the self-sufficiency, there seems to be a need for women to actually ask questions. It's astonishing how few wives do this. And then some young person would come into the home and ask some crazy theological question, which actually probably she could answer. And she'd say, well, look, my husband's giving all the time to answering their questions. He never asks them my questions. Well, first question is, did you ever ask any? Do you ask? If you don't ask, well, of course you won't get an answer. It's very simple. But resentments can come into a relationship sometimes when we ignore the simplest things. He never sits down and talks to me. Well, do you ever ask him a question that would actually catch his mind for more than 5 minutes? There's a lot of difference between asking for 10p to go down to the bus stop and asking him to say, well, look, I've been reading in Jeremiah and I just do not understand where it says that the Jews were going to be here for 70 years. Well, that's a relatively easy one to answer, but he might not know the answer. And many men only begin to grow spiritually when somebody starts asking questions. It was certainly true in my life. I got saved without asking too many questions. Guy who was counselling me did all the questions, and I sort of turned up in my Bible, John 3:16, insert your name at this point, But I didn't start growing until somebody says, why do you believe the Bible to be the Word of God? Well, it's in there, isn't it? Where? 14-year-old kids these were. They weren't going to be put off with any answer. And when my wife starts asking questions, I can tell you, sometimes I'm sweating to find the answer. But it is stimulating, not only intellectually, but spiritually, because the woman is saying, I want to know what you think. And if you do that, you create quite an important bond. And many women are looking for spiritual answers other than the home. They've got cassette tapes, they've got messages, they go to women's meeting, they go to this and that, and that the guy they should be asking is probably getting bored because his wife never does ask him, and she's getting bored because he never talks. Do ask the question. I personally don't feel like I can emphasize that particular aspect of ministry enough. Don't be afraid to ask the stupidest questions. Sometimes husbands don't know the answers to the stupidest questions, and it's high time they did. And if you don't ask, he'll never get the answer. And so don't be afraid of it. It's curious how sometimes we are afraid of each other. Ask questions. Take the example of the Queen of Sheba, who found a believer and asked him all the questions she could. And they weren't just questions. When you read what Solomon talked about, the way of fishes in the sea and the way of trees and the way of this and the way of that, it wasn't all theological by any means. Get into the habit of asking questions. So your first thing, he's got to be someone he can be proud of. Not an easy thing to be. The next thing you have to be is somebody you can live with. There's a lot of difference between being proud of somebody and then actually having to live with that person. There are one or two people I feel quite proud to know. But the thought of living with some of them, why, that's another question altogether. In fact, some of them I'm very glad I don't live with. But how do you live with a person? Well, there are very negative things in the Scripture telling us it's sometimes easier to live in deserts than with women who complain all the time. But the positive things are sometimes not always so easy to find. A simple way is, it is easy to live with a man if he's treated like a man. That sounds very, very simple. And it is. But many of us feel from time to time, partly because of the spirit of the age, partly because of all kinds of different reasons, that inside our own home we are more likely to find war than anything else. If you find rebellion, And rebellion can be passive, but it can be very effective. If you find rebellion, don't be surprised if you find yourself sitting against an army commander on the other side of the table, who's planning strategies, how he can deceive you, how he can get his own way without you ever finding out. It will happen. And the mind of man is deceitful enough to know how to do it. If you treat him like his mother treated him, tell him when to get up and how to fold his trousers and what day he should throw his underwear in the washing and all the other sort of silly little things that men do forget, and you jump on him like an old woman, well, he will treat you like his mother. And most of you fellas know how you treat your mother. Yes, mother, I'll be back at 10 o'clock, lying through his teeth. I'll be back at midnight and not a moment before. But if I say that to my mother, she won't let me go out, will she? We will tend to deceive those who boss us around. Now, don't ask me why that's so, but I'll tend to try and deceive anybody who thinks he can put one over on me just to prove they can't. A sheer cussed streak. I'm not sure how far that's just human and how far that's just me, or even how far it's just male. Maybe you can talk about that. But treat him like a man who is an adult. You know, many of us actually do suffer from the way our elder sisters and our mothers treated us men. We got bossed around by our mother and reminded that we kept soiling nappies and that we were messy and dirty and horrible. And then our sisters, who were older than us, treated us as stupid, and our wives wonder why they have problems. The wonder would be if they didn't, wouldn't it, really? I could tell you some interesting stories about my sisters. Oh, nothing I can remember. The thing that gave me greatest pleasure throughout my entire youth, my relationship with my sister, when I managed to get her to burst into tears. I won't tell you how I did it. But if you want to make a man, there is the idea almost you have to make him feel like a lord. In occasions in the scripture, there is the idea of the woman referring to her husband as her lord. And there's certain groups of Germans who have returned back from Eastern European countries to live in Germany, and they refer to their husband, the wives this is, as their lord. And you say, I'd like to come and see you sometime. She said, excuse me, I must ask my lord. She's going to have half an hour prayer meeting or something. Maybe they found the Urim and the Thummim that have been lost for I don't know how many years. And you wonder. And then she says, well, you know, and then the husband comes in. He says, oh, this fellow wants to come round. Is that okay? But that man has a certain security in that kind of relationship. There is not an independence of spirit that he feels is threatening. Now, obviously, you can't do that all the time, but there is some truth in that. If the man feels like a lord, then he begins to feel like a man, and he might even begin to behave like a man instead of the little boy we were talking about a few moments ago. It's also important, if you're going to live with somebody at times, just to leave them alone. You know, there is a sense when we get married, especially when we get married fairly young and we've still got an awful lot of idealism, to think that we'll never want time alone. Well, we didn't want time alone when we were engaged, did we? Those of you who are engaged will know what I mean. But it is important for both of us to make sure that we let the other person have some time on their own. Men seem to need it more than women do. Well, especially when they come wiped out from work and, you know, they just flop. Or they come back from a trip and they can't utter anything intelligent. Maybe because they've been trying to speak Arabic for a week, I don't know. And they just don't have anything. About the worst thing you could do is breathe down his neck. You say, I've been waiting here for 3 weeks for you to come home, and now all you can do is read the paper. Or look at the post. Leave him alone. No reason why you should jump on him straight away, is there? Well, you say, yes, you know, I mean, the kid's breathing down my neck, and, well, there are 100 reasons. But somehow both of you have to negotiate into your marriage times when you will leave the other person alone. There are some things it really doesn't matter how you do them. And the fact that your parents did it this way and that her parents did it this way doesn't really mean that you two have got to fight over it because you can't agree. If you've got to fight over where the toothpaste tube is squeezed, well, buy 2 toothpastes. Even an OM allowance will get that far. There are crazy things we end up wrestling about. Learn to leave each other alone at key points. It's one of the most vital issues we can learn. Just to back off. And things that aren't important, well, don't make them important. Because the hard thing is deciding what is important, isn't it? And then, if you're going to live with him, you've got to help him in his work. Work is vitally important for a man, as any of you who've known an unemployed man will discover. There is something dreadfully degrading about a man out of work. And in our generation, we have to expect, probably, that some of you will experience that. Maybe for shorter, maybe for longer times. But if your husband has a job, the last thing you should do is be undermining it. You may wish that he was President of the United States, or indeed of Andorra. Doesn't really matter. You may wish that he had something far more significant. Most wives do. At times, wish their husband was doing something rather than just emptying dustbins or whatever is the job it is that he's doing. But don't devalue his job. And the way you do it is by making snide remarks. Well, you know, of course, I mean, all you're doing all day long, just emptying a few dustbins, and then you come home and sit down and you think you're tired. Well, he is. Or imply to the neighbours, well, of course, yes, well, you earn much more now, but my husband, you know, he's only a poor, simple evangelist, and we don't really see many souls saved, but it's easy to do, and we need to be vitally careful. The work is where the guy is getting his recognition, and if his wife won't give him the recognition he needs, there are plenty of secretaries who will. And I have a sneaking suspicion that many Christian marriages go on the rock because wives are sometimes implying that the work is not important. You've got time for those people. You've got time for every Tom, Dick and Harry who comes in here and wants to talk about the Lord. But I want to talk to you once about the housekeeping man, you give me no time at all. Well, that may be a true statement. But that's not the best way to communicate it, because you're setting up what for the man is a totally impossible comparison. To compare his calling from the Lord with your housekeeping money is like comparing flying to the moon with buying a bike for your kid. You know, there's just no relationship between the two. For you there is, because your home is maybe the focus. Where you're spending all your time, you're trying desperately, to work out, well, where you're going to buy the cheese. But for him, the comparison is irrelevant. The Lord has called him to this job, and by you making that comparison, he will tend to dismiss you. Maybe not public, but inside there will be that feeling. Doesn't she understand? The Lord has called me to this work. The Lord has told me I've got to build up believers. The Lord has given me a gift of teaching. Doesn't she understand? Don't devalue the job the man has got. Whatever it is. We do sometimes tend to disparage those who've got, what we call these sort of practical jobs. Driving or a mechanic or whatever. Actually, you will find after a few years there's a very therapeutic value in practical jobs. It will be useful to get your husband to do a few of them. But that's another story. If you're going to make comparisons, leave work out. Leave the work area out of the comparison. And try as far as you can to see the positive aspects of his job. Train yourself in looking for it. Because he may come home one day and say, I really don't know what I'm doing this job for. I really wonder what I'm doing. I really wonder if I've got... And what he may be saying is, look, I'm going through a crisis of identity. Do you see anything in it that could possibly be useful? And if he's used to using you as a partner, he'll do that. It's important for you then to sort of point out those points where we say, well, yes, dear, here and here and here and here.
But you won't come out with an answer like that if you've never thought about it. Encourage the whole idea of work. Work is as important for the man as rearing children and looking after a home is for most women. And it leads to holiness. And if you disparage his work, you're disparaging God's way of making that man holy, or at least one of them. So you're taking issue not with just with your husband, but with God too. Then forgiveness. There's a lot one could say about that, but it's vitally important we do. If you're going to live with each other, you've just got to accept that the guy you married, or intend to marry, or hope to marry, or dream about, is going to make some pretty interesting mistakes. Probably in the area of money, he's going to make some major boobs. Probably in the area of not considering you at a point where you really feel it's so obvious that he should remember your birthday or your wedding anniversary or the day your mother died or whatever, and he probably will completely forget at some point. There'll be a reason for it. You might not know it. Forgive him. I feel we have to sometimes deliberately ask for forgiveness and deliberately give forgiveness. So many times in Christian circles we play around with the jargon of, oh, of course I forgive you. But you don't forget it. Well, if you don't forget it, you haven't forgiven them. And I sometimes have asked my wife, I've said to her, do you forgive me on that? Usually she said yes. In fact, she always has so far. And I said, well, you know, we can't talk about that anymore. And there's that little silence, and I think, I've lost a card I could have played. I've lost an opportunity to score points. But if that's what you're looking for, something's going wrong anyway, isn't it? Express deliberately forgiveness. And be committed to him. Peter quoted one of the Beatles songs this morning. There was an interesting one that says, will you still need me? Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? Some of us are nearer there than we'd really like to be. But a man will never tell you he needs security. The woman will. They go on about security till it drives most of us men mad. But there is that longing. Will she stick with it? Will she hold on? Most of us want them to, or want you to. And sometimes it's good to communicate that. You have to decide best how. Then, that's someone to live with. Thirdly, a partner to help him. There is all the difference in the world between a partner and a ball and chain. All the difference in the world. Somehow you have to help your partner emotionally. You can sometimes tell the emotional state of a couple by the way they talk or the way they joke. And if a husband begins to start expressing feelings, or a man does, a very unusual thing in our culture, and is met with sarcasm, you're in trouble. Maybe not this year, but in a few years' time. Never, I would say, be sarcastic when a husband's feelings are involved. And watch how you joke about your husband's feeling. He won't tell you he's hurting inside. He never will. Unless he's a very unusual man, and there are not so many of them around, alas. It's quite wounding to find how often women can put down men with a joke about when he expresses affection, sometimes in a very quiet way. Yeah, I quite like you. Oh, really? Yeah, reckon you do. Yeah, that's what my mother used to say. Or some kind of throwaway line, and the man thinks, won't tell her I love her again. It's not worth it. Get wounded. Help him to feel secure emotionally. That's a massive topic we don't have time to go into. Sexually, an area probably of far more distress than many of us realize. And I certainly am not qualified to talk about it for any length of time, but it seems to me that by and large a man is much prouder of his body than a woman ever is. And the worst physical specimen you can imagine, male, will be proud of his body than the best specimen you can see, female. Now, I don't understand why that is. But you need, I think, to be incredibly careful in that area with the kind of terminology you bounce around, you use, you think about when the body is involved. Now, I'm not just thinking of sexual relations, but generally speaking, watch out when you refer to how much hair your husband does or does not have, or how many muscles he does or does not have, or how strong or weak he is in relation to other people. You're in an area of incredible danger, especially if you're starting indicating the guy's getting old and toothless. Most of us are more sensitive to that than we would really ever like to admit. And the demand for sex will almost always be more from the man than the woman. There are a few unusual cases, I think, where it's the other way around. But I only ever read about those kind of cases. And my feeling is that the man likes, after marriage, to feel that he can also still be seduced. There is an awful feeling in marriage when you begin to get the feeling that you're the only one who wants sex. And that you've got to somehow use every device in the book to get your wife to agree. I realise, of course, that I'm talking now to married people only. Hope that's clear. But there is a danger. You know, we get these sort of, so many books talk about, well, of course, the man, he always wants it and the woman never does. And there may be an element of truth in that. But a woman who is sensitive to the needs of her husband will realise that from time to time he does enjoy being seduced. And if she ignores that side of him, there will always be a side of her husband that she just doesn't understand. I have a suspicion that men are far more pornographic in their thinking than many of them like to admit publicly. And that many times wives just don't understand it at all. Well, this isn't the place to sort of go into great and gory detail. I don't think it's necessary. But don't devalue that side of life. And it's very, very, very easy. And it's a lot more is involved than just having sex. A lot more. I would say we need a lot of communication on that, and it's not an easy area to get communication on. Because most of those who've been brought up in my generation have been tyrannized, and I hope you won't misunderstand this, tyrannized by the need of the female orgasm. We've read books on the husband for years and years and years has dominated the poor woman sexually till she's frightened to get into bed. It will be the biggest the biggest threat to our relationship long term. And it is up to us both as adult partners to somehow get a time into our regular schedule where we can both be adults, where we can talk together, where the children are out of the way. A very hard thing to do, vital. Money, probably we'll touch on tomorrow. There is a temptation for men who are bad at communicating to assume that they can buy their wives' love. I don't understand why this is so, but I've seen it happen again and again. A temptation, my wife is complaining about this, about the washing, I'll buy her a washing machine. Wife is complaining about how long it takes to cook, so she'll buy her a microwave. And all the time trying to communicate somehow, look, I really am listening to you. And the wife is probably not even aware of it sometimes. And it's very easy for a wife to push a man towards materialism, maybe unwittingly. And in OM, I think we have to be desperately careful in that area. There's a natural tendency in a group like this, a natural tendency to look around and say, oh, this guy's got a house, this guy's got a television, this guy's got a bigger car than us. Why can't we have it? We're in the same ministry. And the wives are the ones who tend to hear what the other people are getting. And we need to be desperately careful to accept our husband's material standards there. Maybe the guy has thrown away a good job deliberately because he wants to serve the Lord. And if you push him into materialism, however subtly or however carelessly, you are threatening his whole relationship with God. Most people who've come into OM have thrown away good economic prospects to do it. Most people who go into Christian ministry have said, money is not the most important thing to me. And if a wife communicates that money is the most important thing, the whole basis goes under challenge. I'm not suggesting for one moment that we must make do with too little. But I do believe it is a very, very big danger to try and get the balance, especially when your husband will almost certainly want you to be generous as well. He'll want you to be generous in giving time to his friends in hospitality, and he'll even tell you it's biblical. And somehow there is a tension there. I'm not sure how to resolve it. Maybe that'll come up in question time. But when you talk about things, be very, very careful, because the husband will tend to hear, I want whatever it is. That's what he'll tend to hear. So beware. I must close. I think it's important, perhaps just to bear a thought, to close on an idea from Bonhoeffer. I realise that theologically some of you may have questions about him. But Bonhoeffer was once speaking of idealism, and most of us are idealists when it comes to marriage. We have this dream of an ideal man and an ideal woman, and we think the two will make an ideal couple. Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. But if you have an ideal goal and it doesn't reach fruition as soon as you think it should, there is a natural tendency to blame others. If things are not going right because your ideals are not being fulfilled, you will naturally tend to blame the other party. If it still doesn't go right, you will probably then develop to blaming yourself. And if it still doesn't go right after you've done that, you may well blame God. A very natural progression. We are idealistic. We do have goals. But beware. You can blame others. You can blame yourself, and you can blame God. And the effect of it will be ultimately to take you out of the kingdom. Or maybe to prove you were never in it, or whatever that big theological issue is. Let's not raise that right now. A few points. I think it's finally important to see the man is responsible spiritually. There is a danger for a woman to come between a man and his God. And whatever else you do or do not do as a wife, or as somebody who hopes to be a wife, whatever else you don't do, you must encourage the man somehow to keep in step with God, even if it's going to hurt you. Most men will not deliberately take a step towards God if they know their wife is going to get hurt. You can see that from the very first. When Adam was forced to choose between listening to God or taking the fruit that his wife offered him, well, you know the result the same as I did. And Adam was responsible. The man is responsible, but he needs all the encouragement you can give him to be a man of God. All of it. And I think we must set our goals, we must encourage one another to walk with God. And my wife was encouraging me quite recently in this area. She says, you know, there are things that I'm afraid if we really follow God, might go a way that I wouldn't necessarily now say yes to. But don't turn back because of me. I don't want you saying 2 days after I die, well, I listened to Anna Marie more than the Lord. She said, I would rather you went for the Lord and you can pull me along behind. But take the Lord first. And that, to me, is the hallmark of a wife who's worth having. And where the man will say, he who finds a wife finds a whole interesting bundle of things, but a good thing. Encourage him to be responsible and go with him when he's stepping out in faith. That is absolutely key. And with that, I think I'll stop. Let's just pray. Father, we praise you that you've set us high standards, standards that give our lives individually and collectively a value far more significant than we many times realize. We thank you that you do care how we live each day of our lives. You're interested in us and you want us to encourage one another. Father, we pray that you will show each one of us, whether we're married or not, how we can use the time that you give us, use the talents that you've given us to encourage one another to follow you. Lord, we know there's a cost. Many of us have considered it from time to time, and many of us are afraid of it. But we thank you that we can encourage each other to go on with you because we know that you love us with all your heart. Thank you, Lord, for your care for us. Amen. Yeah, it is obviously very important to be honest. And honesty within all of our relationships, I think, can't be overemphasized, especially amongst believers. The question, of course, is when the question gets asked. If a guy asks you the question on the way to the airport, it probably means he's not altogether sure himself whether he should be going. And for you to say, well, actually, I'm 100% convinced this is out of the will of God, may not help him very much. And you say, well, dear, I have given a lot of thought to that question. I'd like to discuss it with you. Can we do it when you come back? Maybe a way around it. If you do have serious doubts about what your husband is doing, and many wives do from time to time, if you do have doubts about how he is using his time and his abilities, then certainly that has to come into discussion at some point. The question is, how do you raise the issue? And I think there, one has probably to come at it spiritually and say, many people are asking or want to know what you do, or what your job is, or what your gift is, or what your ministry is. What do you feel it is? And begin it so that you're asking him to tell you really what his ministry, what his goals, what his visions are. And you say, what are we trying to do together? And then as he shares with you, you can say, well, it doesn't seem to me that that and that match together. A man, I feel, when there's a serious discussion going on, is very happy to discuss, providing it's in an area at a time when he's not under pressure. It is never good to tell a guy he's not doing a good job. If he's mending a tyre on the car and he's just trying to get the last nut back on, you say you think he's done it wrong. And I can remember a situation that happened in my sister's home. I spent the whole day, wallpapering the house. And actually, my brother-in-law, he can't wallpaper for nuts. Well, it wasn't really very strategic for my sister to point that fact out at that point. To say, well, this pattern deer actually has got this much gap, and you've somehow managed to... that's just crazy. She should have said it would be better if he'd never started. But she should have said that before he started. She knew he was no good at it. But So yes, by all means, open communication. If the guy asks, say, create a situation where he will give you time to discuss it. That, I think, is absolutely vital. But then be honest. I don't think there's anything wrong when a question is asked by saying, look, I don't want to answer that straight away. I'm not in a position to, you know how emotional women are, you know. And give me some time. And then take the time. That would be my immediate answer on that. But yes, if you think he's wasting his time and his talents and his gifts, that means either you have to change your view absolutely 100%, or you have to talk about it. And probably you should talk about it first. Does that answer it?
Very much the wife in that the whole lifestyle involved is just not down to the job. So how much do you feel that the wife must have the calling to the husband's job, for instance, or whether the husband is sufficient for the husband to have the calling?
How? Or, yeah, in order for them to both be in OM.
Because it's really the husband's job that brings the person into it.
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? It's simple if the guy is already in OM. If he's in OM and you choose to marry him and you don't make it a condition of marriage that he leaves OM, well, it's your own fault. I think it's as simple as that. If the guy after you get married suddenly gets this vision to go off into OM and you don't share the vision, well, you've got a problem. And the first problem is one of simple communication. I feel actually, really, it is nice if the wife shares the vision. The man would definitely prefer it that way. But if he feels God is really calling him into that, she must go with him. She must stand with him. She promised she would go with him, and she has to do that. Now, it's much nicer if he is willing to slow down enough for her to catch up. But some men, it's very hard to get him to stand on the brake. Some people drive as if there are no brakes. And if you don't believe me, go to Vienna sometime. That's the only way they do drive. But then I think the wife, it is difficult, but the wife has got to say, well, I'll go along with you. That is as a man, Toast can maybe give the balance tomorrow.
That's all those things tomorrow.
But that would be my reaction, that the man is responsible spiritually, and because of that, if you shoot him down when he's stepping out in faith, you're likely to get into a situation where you'll be going to church 10 years from now and he won't. And you've only got to go in the churches to see how often that happens. And that, I think, is a very high price to pay for the power of veto. Another question.
John, don't you think I'm sort of thinking of a situation where I've had some who have they've gone to their husbands because they believe that that's what the Lord is wanting them to do as a wife, go with the husband. They've never really in their heart of hearts felt called to do that work. And in time it has worked out and they've felt it, told the situation and at peace. But I've also known the other side where they've done it because they're told to, or because they want to be obedient to their husbands as well, and have never been happy. And they've said to me, well, how long do you think, because in hearing the situation, I said, well, I'm sure God will honour you for what you're doing. And that, I was thinking that, eventually they would feel the situation was right. And the other side is that I've had somebody say, well, if that person was my husband, I would at least think he loved me enough not to make me go through that.
Ooh. The question of whether a husband, or you can never say to a husband loves me so much he won't put me through a situation that is actually impossible or very difficult for me.
That isn't just after 3 months.
Yeah.
I'm talking about years.
of course, we all know of these situations where a wife faithfully follows the man and is utterly miserable. One thing we can never ever evaluate is whether the person would have been less miserable doing something else. And I think we do sometimes have to raise that question. I feel it is an immoral approach, a real kick below the belt, if you say, if my husband really loved me, he wouldn't do it. Because most men, especially most men who love the Lord, don't deliberately choose to do something harder just to plague their wives. In fact, I don't know of one single case. I know of some cases where they've done some stupid things and their wives have got hurt. But I've never known them deliberately get into a situation to annoy their wives. They're doing it because they believe this is of God. And I think that is the first thing, is to try and somehow discuss together what is God really calling him to do. And many wives and husbands don't seem to discuss that. The husband seems to have a vision, and the wife seems to be sort of tied on the back like a trailer on the back of a car. You know, she can come along. And I think it's vital to try and communicate what he thinks his vision is and what she thinks his vision is. I mean, we all know the situation in the brethren assemblies where a guy thinks he can preach and wants to stand up in the morning meeting, and the woman hangs on to his coat because she knows he can't. And I have actually seen that happen, a woman hanging for dear life on the guy's jacket so he didn't stand up.
I've seen it.
Well, we see... Receive much, much better. A man can stand up, make an utter fool of himself, and the wife will see it and feel it and sweat for him. And the man will say, well, really had the unction of the Lord today. And the wife will say, if only you knew what they were saying. We all know the OM team leader's wife who is desperately patching up relationships because this guy is such a thickhead, he doesn't have any idea what's going on. Well, somehow the wife has to get into a situation of communicating what she thinks in a situation where there's time and where it can be done with love. And that is difficult, but it is absolutely imperative. But finally, my leaning is, if the man still says, well, I'm going forward, the woman has just got to trust that the Lord will give her the strength to cope with that situation. But I don't think there's an easy answer to it. But many times I feel it's a lack of the man treating the woman as a partner. And sometimes that goes back a long way. And it may mean that you've got to unbury a whole load of other things before you can really get at what you feel that problem is. If a husband doesn't consult you, start asking yourself why. Does it mean you've been kicking him around like his mother? Or does it mean you haven't been responding to hints? Most men throw out hints of what they want. I mean, in one simple area, most women I talk to have no idea what to buy men for a present. Now, the Japanese don't have this problem. They fill the shops up with stuff that men want. And most wives have got no idea. So I don't know what to buy my husband. They've got no idea whether he wants a spanner or whether he wants a pencil. Curiously, men don't have the same problem. They can always somehow, even if it is a bunch of flowers, come up with something that the wife will want. But most men will throw out hints. And if a husband stops listening to it, it may be because you haven't picked those hints up. Now, I wish I could give you 4 or 5 easy clues to how you can recognize a hint when it comes. But it actually isn't quite as easy as that. But if you watch people walking down a street, and wives, I think this is absolutely crucial, if you go shopping with your husband, try somehow to watch his eyes. They don't always go, very difficult, you know. That's why I said try something. They don't always go to the nicest piece of skirt, as we used to say in England. Sometimes they go to all kinds of things, and if you get the message, you'll find it will begin to open doors in communication. But many times, you know, you're wanting it the other way. You're expecting the husband to notice which dress you're looking at in the shop window, while he's busily got his eyes on a sort of video TV set that's a special offer that you could actually afford. both looking in two completely different directions. But try and ask yourself, can I respond to a hint? Do I know when he's hinting something? I probably important the other way around too, but I don't know. Does that help? Tell me if you think that's... Anything else? Yeah.
Become couples. A marriage is a couple that they can go to come, and then it comes up because I think a lot of problems wouldn't be if really the wife would just make the call. And out from our own situation, if we would have gone and we had the call, I think we would have had a breakdown. But so I know we are in a situation the Lord wanted us, and so I have the ability to be full. Of course, the Lord's help, but otherwise, I'm going to be full. And I think here comes, if you have a couple and where you can talk to, and they can say, well, we are sex, that's my sex, and then it goes through.
I think, the emphasis there is on getting a couple or having a couple apart from you who will help you in evaluating one another's goals, ministries, way of life, etc., etc. I think that is very, very valuable, and I would agree 100%, except in practical terms I find it is very hard to find such couples. But I agree, I agree it's highly desirable to look for at least one couple who you can really talk with. I think, I touched on this, when a man gets a call, I think if he's sensitive to his wife, he will give his wife time to come with him. The problem is when the wife never does. That's a whole nother game. But it's somehow reconciling two different temperaments, where the wife who will never come and the man who will always go, and sort of getting somewhere into the middle. I find, that we men usually have to slow down. But the problem is, some of us are very bad at that. Yeah.
If you take this wife out, that never does come, see what you can break down outside.
Yeah. Our situation, we're talking about guidance and how as a single person you have to trust the Lord very specifically. You get married and then you just sort of surrender the guidance to your husband. Actually, in our situation, Anna Marie had a word where she felt the Lord was talking really clearly to her about our situation years before it happened and years before I was even anywhere near it. But just she trusted the Lord and we moved gradually towards each other on that. I think my own feeling is that a wife should be expecting to get clear leading from the Lord as well as the husband. I think it's the healthy ideal. I think if you see two people in a marriage coming from completely different sides of emotional and just a different way of looking at things, but both actually eventually coming to the same point, that is a tremendous reinforcer for your leading when one or other of you get doubts. And so for sure you will. If you both say, well, the Lord led us both to this point, I would think a wife should expect to find the same leading as her husband, or at least coming towards the same point. And we were talking about a rather extreme situation where we say the wife is just totally unwilling to come, or whatever. But I would expect that would be my ideal, to have both partners trusting the Lord for guidance and both getting it, not in the same way necessarily, and then agreeing together, well, yes, look, we've come together on this, isn't it terrific? That's the ideal, I think. I wouldn't like to guess how often it does or does not happen. Right, yeah.
John, you said about liking somebody
you look at a man looking for someone that's attractive, that he can be proud of, and someone that's not always asking him to get down on his knees and pray. But maybe there is a balance here of what kind of spiritual things does a man look for in a woman? Is it someone that's out all the time, on evangelism, or is there someone that spends a lot of time in prayer, or what are the qualities maybe that single people can?
A woman, I think, needs to have a relationship with God that is not dependent on the husband. That she will survive spiritually extremely put even if he doesn't. And I think the man has to as well. They both have to be able to stand spiritually on their own, in one sense. Now that is open to misunderstanding, I am aware. But I think a man respects a woman who he sees is a woman of God. Whether or not he respects her because she's a good evangelist, a good counselor, a good this or that, will depend on the man and the situation. I don't think most men are looking for super evangelists or super Bible teachers or anything else when they get married. They want to see a woman who obviously knows the Lord and obviously wants to do the Lord's will. I find in my situation, this is really the only one I can talk about, that I have times when I really want to see the family having a family altar, praying together, talking about the scriptures together, and other times I'm just flop. And then I need Anna Marie somehow to say, well, we haven't prayed together for a while, we've got some time now, what about it? And to somehow come at it without it being a judgment on your incompetence as a man. Because the moment a woman says to you, we haven't prayed together, actually that is a condemnation in one sense, especially if the man is aware he should be setting the pace. But he needs that gentle encouragement, or maybe just a word that will lead back into a spiritual family life without condemnation. I think to me it's a matter of tone probably more than anything else. So a woman who is already had answers to prayer, knows there is a God, trusts God, and can stand. A woman who will encourage him at the points where he's beginning to sag. And I feel there is a need for... What happened to mine? Who will reinforce him where he is theologically strong. There is a curious attraction in men, I think, for being different. There's certainly in me. I mean, some people called it just being bloody minded. And there's a certain truth in that. But there's an attraction in somehow getting an idea that, is different from everybody else's. So I think a man potentially can shoot off a theological sidetrack very, very easily. And a stable woman who will somehow be praying and questioning can keep from that. I find it very difficult to sort of really touch what I want to say on that. But I think a lot of women don't really talk with their husbands as spiritual equals, which I think they are. And I've been so dinned into them that a woman has got to keep silent and the woman is a theological ignoramus and I don't know what else, that they just don't say anything, which I think is sad. And I found our situation that transformed in a way our whole lifestyle and marriage was when I came out with an idea on New Year's Eve one year. Said, I think we're going to read the Bible through next year. Well, Anna Marie's inner attitude was total incredibility. She said, yeah, guy's crazy, we've never done that before, we're not going to do it now. That's what she thought, but she only told me that in June. By which time we were more than halfway through. She sort of said, well, okay, let's try, I sensed disbelief, but I didn't meet total, don't be ridiculous. This is a totally impossible goal. Well, actually, that year totally changed our thinking. And during the year, we encouraged each other. And when we were reading a passage, I can't even remember all the passages, she would say, I don't understand that. Oh, well, neither do I, actually. But sometimes we would spend literally 4 or 5 hours discussing a passage together. Wouldn't be every night. Some nights we just about managed to get through it before our eyelids were completely shut, especially in Chronicles' genealogies. But encouraging each other, just on those kind of things. When the man has an idea, the woman somehow gently reinforcing it and holding theologically when he begins to. There's a couple of ideas that potentially wild that I have. Anna Marie says, well, it sounds interesting, that idea, and as she begins to talk, I begin to sense that, it is wild. But that's quite an important role, and it's very hard to actually put your finger on. But I think wives are sometimes afraid of talking theologically and challenging theologically the way their men think. And I think men need that. Much healthier to have your heresies with your wife and then have them sorted out, rather than preach them first. It's my view. Maybe an unusual view. But I think Christians, curiously, are afraid of talking biblically together. You ever notice you come to an IM conference where everybody loves the Lord, and we spend our whole time talking about which car broke down where between here and Iran, which border crossing was easy, which was difficult, but you never, or very rarely hear somebody saying, well, I really don't understand Leviticus 23. Now, there is, of course, we need the two, but I would like us to, I think in our marriages, if there was a little bit more talk on this kind of level, I think that the long-term effect would be absolutely incredible. But I don't know how you get that. I mean, we're moving to it and away from it almost all the time. Some days we talk a lot about the Scripture, other days we don't talk any. But I think there needs to be in our home far more talk about the Scriptures. And it may be we need to throw out televisions, cassette recorders, radios, books, and just have a Bible left from time to time. That may be an extreme view, but I think Hudson Taylor, when he chucked novels over the side of the ship, certainly most OMers haven't gone that extreme yet. Just imagine chucking all the novels over the side of Doulos. What a terrific task.
I think we should thank God for having the courage to take this subject.